Okay, we are officially recording. Um, I'm asking you to do two things that are related. The first one is to explain some of the different ways that we think about the terms culture and nation when we're trying to understand different societies. That's the first thing. That's worth 20 points out of 40. The second thing is, and this isn't a paragraph or two, this is just get in, say it, get out, that's fine. Um, Explain how culture or cultures can complicate public governance, being able to govern a society in a nation state. Sometimes we think of culture as, we think of multiculturalism and we celebrate diversity and all that without thinking this complicates things. And some of what we're going to talk about today. To help you do that, I added an additional article, and it's called Group Differentiated Rights. It's actually a summary of a much longer article, and it's this concept of group differentiated rights. And the idea behind that is sometimes for very good reasons, we can create a regime of law that can really complicate how we govern and who gets what, when, and how. Okay. And, if it helps you, it helps you. Now, here are some things that I want you to remember. Okay. This is very important. And I explain this. Okay. And I actually capitalize apply assigned readings. I don't want to know what your opinion is, okay, any more than you want to know what mine is. You don't want to come in here and just have me teach you my opinion or how I feel today or something like that. You want me to offer you things of substance that will help you make sense of the world, or if nothing else, will help you graduate, from college, from whichever. All right, it's the same thing. I want you, when you're doing these assignments, first of all, to admit what you don't know and be comfortable with that. Okay, especially in an introductory class, but I have to remind my upper division students of the same things. They're not experts yet. Some of them never will be, and that's fine, but it doesn't mean you can't learn more. But you can't learn more if you only insist on expressing yourself with what you think you already know. Because one of the things, and certainly a college education did this for me, you start finding out that a lot of things you were pretty sure of turn out to be garbage. That's okay. That's called learning. It's okay. It's not a corrupt process. Okay. So you need to cite every source every time you use it. And when I do that, I mean, if you just said, we have these four links. What is culture? Global system of nation states, cultural nationalism, whatever. And if you click on one of those links and you might say, well, okay, let's see. Okay, What is Culture has an author, Helen Spencer Odie. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cite Spencer Odie, and is there a page number associated with that? Yes, there is. So I'm going to say Spencer Odie, page 1. That's where I got this. Okay, and it's something that everyone should do on every single piece of academic work that you do. It's never enough, unless you're in a creative writing class or perhaps a psychology class or a philosophy class where you're actually being asked an opinion. Okay. And that's an important component of the class. You're talking about opinion formation, where when I used to teach the methods class, we did a lot of stuff on public opinion and survey research. And I would create these little survey questionnaires that students, would fill out, where I'm asking them for their attitude or their belief or their opinion or whatever. Other than that, though, okay, when you're trying to demonstrate what you've learned, you can't do that by expressing an opinion, because no opinion, in order to be an opinion, has to have any kind of fact behind it at all, any kind of information at all. It can just be something you've decided to believe in, okay? I mean, if you think about, for example, think about religion. Does anybody really want to have to sit down and explain what it means to believe in God or to be religious? I don't think most religious people want to do that. They take it on faith. That's the enduring component, at least of the three desert religions, is, they're all faith-based. I would say that things like Buddhism, probably less so in the strictest sense. You don't think of a single vengeful, wrathful God or whatever kind of thing people are throwing at you. But the idea is not that you have to explain that. Okay, that's because the function of religion isn't to explain things. The primary function of religion really is to help you cope with things that reason can't help you cope with. Okay, that's fine, but that's not what we're doing here. So this isn't how you feel. This isn't what you think. This is what you demonstrating to me or any instructor, what you understand, what you've been able to connect together into a sense of understanding is an indication of what you've learned. And, that's going to be the same, certainly with me. It's going to be the same with any class you take from me. I'm not interested, unless we're talking outside of class or something like that. And then, yeah, I'll often say, well, what do you think about this or what? That's fine. But it's not an indication of what you know. Okay, so, and that's what we're trying to get is, what do you understand? What have you learned? So these assignments, one way you can demonstrate that and also avoid plagiarism, which is a very nasty thing to do with tremendous consequences, is by saying, well, when I was reading, if you can't remember the author, now why you'd have to remember, I don't know, because these are essentially open book, open note assignments. But if for some reason you space on that, or you have an assignment or an assigned reading, and you're trying to use it in an assignment like the nation state one that really doesn't have an author, you just say, you can say, sorry, my system's running slow. You can just say global system article, whatever, something like that. Give me as much information as you can. Okay. And that way you're showing me, I used the literature. Now, should you use all of it? Yeah, you should. Can you still pass the assignment if you don't? Yeah, probably. But you're going to do better if you show me that you can connect things, because some of you, when I've talked to you during virtual office hours, have already demonstrated to me that you understand how these things fit together, and you see that there's a kind of method in my madness in terms of not only what I'm doing, but even the order in which I list the links. It has a kind of reasoning behind it. It's got a purpose, okay? So are there any questions on the assignment? Due at 11 o'clock on Sunday. It's not time bound in the sense that once you start it, it's an essay. You don't have to upload it until you're ready. So you can fiddle with it every minute of the day between now and 11 o'clock on Sunday. It's not a time bound quiz in that sense, but it does have a deadline, and the deadline matters. And unless you make a specific request and I respond specifically to you in email, I won't accept a late assignment. Because it just, I can't grade everything until I have all the assignments turned in. And when I've already explained why. So are there any questions on this next assignment? We're going to review today and sort of finish up a little bit. But
should those two parts be cohesive in a whole sort of thing?
They need not be. I broke those up intentionally because ultimately, if this were an upper division class where you'd had multiple exposures to this kind of material, yeah, the objective, Tristan, would be to link these things together. But at this stage, if you can just take those as separate elements and go deeply into each one of those in a paragraph or so, that's sufficient for this assignment. If you can connect them together, that's fine. You can do that. But I want to make sure that you do them. The reason I have them numbered 1 and 2 is because I want them to be distinct elements in terms of how you present, so that you mark one number 1 and then mark one number 2, because I'm going to grade them that way. Because some of you might be more comfortable answering one of those than the other, and so I try to take that into account. But I don't expect you to link those things together if you're not yet ready to do that. Some of you may not be ready to do that. Again, use the readings and cite them every time you use it. Citations, by the way, are important even when you're not quoting directly in this and every academic assignment. Most of the time, people don't want to read extensive direct quotes from something. They can go to the original source if they want that. And if you just quote from the reading and you don't explain that you know what that means, you don't demonstrate understanding. All you've shown me is that with relatively unlimited time and a bunch of readings that I've picked for you, you don't even have to find them, that you can go in and find something that you think is important. And some people will make that mistake. They'll just pull out quotes, toss them on the page, but there's nothing that connects them together. They may or may not address the prompt of the assignment. And then they say, well, I worked really hard on that and I used the reading, so why didn't I get an A? Because you don't demonstrate you know anything. You don't demonstrate what you understand. So the readings are there to inform your understanding. Okay. And that's it. Anything else on the assignment? Okay. I also want you to be much more considered in your writing. I want you to avoid some of the obvious mistakes that undermine some of your earlier writing on the last assignment, where you're writing in sentence fragments or something, or you're writing in such a way that the syntax is broken and it takes me 3 or 4 goes to read what you're saying and try and figure out what you mean. I shouldn't have to, I'm not being facetious when I say this, I shouldn't have to approach this as an exercise in translation, okay? It is incumbent upon you as university students to be able to express yourself coherently on the page. You need to be able to do that. There are very few things more important for you right now than to be able to express yourself coherently. Now, this assignment requires you to do it on the page. You know, if it was a class presentation, you'd be expected to do that, verbally, okay? But you really need to apply yourself to that. Most of you fail on that because you don't try very hard. You don't give me a second draft. You crank out something and you think, okay, there, I barfed out that assignment. Now I never have to look at it again, without thinking, maybe I better go back and look at that and make sure it's actually coherent, that it actually says what I want it to say. That's a common failing of undergraduate writing, even at the upper division level. I would remind you that, I mean, I write all the time and I like writing. I still have to go back. Like when I write these little prompts, I'll write them. Okay, I got that. I'll always, some of you have wondered, why don't you just put the prompt up right away? Part of it is, I've mentioned, I think, I don't want you studying to the prompt. I want you engaging with the material in a more extemporaneous way, okay? But also, depending upon how we cover the material, I will revise that prompt. I've revised this prompt 3 times. Okay, I've tightened it up a little bit. I've changed the emphasis a little bit because the class discussions we've had have gone in a certain direction. And as a consequence of that, I try to design the prompts based on what we've emphasized in class, okay? So even there, I mean, somebody who writes all the time and isn't bad at it, I have to revise my writing all the time. There's no shame in that. You know, the old editorial argument was there's no such thing as good writing, there's only good rewriting. And that's kind of true, all right? I had the displeasure to read a first draft of a novel by a fairly prominent American novelist whose name I can't say because I could get in trouble or embarrass that novelist. It was, in social science terms, using the proper terminology of an academic, it was absolute shit. It really was. This was written by someone who can't write. And what a lot of you don't realize is, those few of you who actually read even novels, a lot of what you're reading was written by a developmental editor. It wasn't even written by the author anymore. So again, what does a developmental editor do? I know because I used to be one. You rewrite their writing. I had a professor in graduate school who was writing a book. And the only problem with that was he couldn't write. I mean, he couldn't write at all, right? And he was chair of the department and had a PhD and everything else. And he couldn't write his way out of a paper bag, So I wrote his book, it's because I could write. Writing's important. I don't know how this guy got through graduate school. I mean, he wasn't an idiot. I mean, well, he wasn't, he was smart. It's just that all of his writing was crap. It really was awful. Okay. So writing is important. Okay. It's a good skill to have. And I'm not yet ready to concede that we're a completely post-literate society. I think there's a virtue in mastering the language on the page. I think it can help you in terms of mastering spoken language and a number of other things. Okay. Now, are there then, one more thing, I'm sorry. One more thing just specific to the mechanics of the class. You will notice if you look at Module 4, there are not any Zoom links posted for Module 4 or Module 5 yet. Don't worry about that. One of the reasons why I held off on that was at the beginning of the term, there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty about just how this was going to work. We'd had a lot of students who'd had problems with Zoom. I didn't know if I was going to have to move everything to a completely, online format or something like that. So I did links up to the point where I was sure I could cover it. There was some question as to whether or not at some point in the term we might go back to face and all that, because this Moodle site was something that was drafted sometime in the middle of the summer. Okay. When we're done here today, I'll post the next couple of links, but just assume as though this were a class meeting on campus that you're be available at 10:30 on Mondays and Wednesdays. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah, it's not me being lazy, it's me being cautious. Okay, there may also be a time when we just decide we need a day off, and it's like, look, let's take a day off, the hell with it. Now, when we do that, what I'll hold an office hour during that class. Like in week 11, for example, when some of your instructors may have finals for you, I might just say, look, I'll be online from 10:30 to 11:30 or something like that. If you have questions or anything, you've got an assignment to do, but we don't need to meet as a class. I don't have a problem with that. Yeah, Patricia.
I got an email saying that school is not in session on the 12th.
Yeah, that's just changed. That was on my notes, and I almost thank you because I would have forgotten to say that. So
It's
that's
the
a Wednesday.
11th.
That's a Wednesday that we have off, right?
Right.
But there again, I won't put a link up for that. Now, here's what's important. I can't even meet with you on that day. No, this is important. I also cannot meet with you during Thanksgiving week. I'm not allowed to. We don't get paid. Those are what are called furlough days. That's our pay cut. Okay, we took about a 5 to 7% pay cut this year as part of the pandemic emergency and everything else. The budgetary hit to the university. The staff did too. Everybody did. Even the administration took a big pay cut. So I'm not trying to pat faculty on the back, but I'm saying I'm not allowed to meet with you then. It would violate the collective bargaining agreement. Okay, and so I'm just letting you know well in advance. During Thanksgiving week, I got to be off the hook. Okay. Now, let me just say it this way, though. Yeah, I'm recording, I know. You know how valuable I think it is to do everything the administration says we should do, right? You understand how important I think that is. Can I get a witness? Okay. So in other words, we just have to, we have to, how can I say this? We have to respect that. All right. Okay, that's all of my thing. Patricia, thank you also for reminding me about, it's a Veterans Day, actually. Yeah, I will have to remember not to post a link there. I'll also try to remember to send out some sort of a reminder to you. Have you all been notified of that, by the way? Because that was a recent change, that campus would be closed, yeah.
Yeah, I got the email.
Okay, because normally we meet. I think they're counting that as a furlough day. I'm not really sure. All right, so anyway, then let's go back, look at our readings. Are there any questions then on what we've covered so far? We've talked about culture and sort of the challenge of defining what a culture is. One of the things that I suggested is that, not to think of a culture as a single thing, okay, but as a concept that incorporates a lot of different elements through which people express a shared identity. Okay, it's these various elements that express a shared identity, and we used some examples of that, right? We talked about language, and it could be food, it could be a shared sense of history, a shared sense of superiority, or a shared sense of oppression. It can be a lot of things, but it is a shared experience yielding an identity that's expressed in these various ways. You can express it through your music, you can express it through poetry, the fine arts. It might even affect the way that you structure an economy. Some cultures are not really as capitalist as others. They don't really value wealth or ostentatious displays of wealth, right? If you go into Scandinavian countries, for example, in most Scandinavian countries, it's really considered unseemly to hold yourself superior to other people. Okay, it's just something you don't do. It's discouraged because it would be like, standing outside and yelling at everyone how rich you are and how famous you are and how wonderful you are and everything else. You just don't do that. It's wrong. It's just considered wrong. Well, that's an articulation of a kind of a sense of identity that's very different, for example, from the way we are in the United States, where your worth is often dependent upon how much money you have or how much wealth you have. Well, so that is a way of expressing a sense of identity. We're more individualistic in the United States than most of the rest of the world. That's a cultural trait, okay? So are there questions on what I mean by this term culture as it's discussed, particularly in the what is culture argument? I realize a lot of that is kind of dry and hard to thaw out, but those are the kind of things that I think the conclusions we can draw from cultures. It's about expressing a sense of shared identity. Okay. Now, remember, we included in that, if you're comfortable going that far, the notion of a subculture. We also talked about cultural nationalism. That's kind of what we talked about in the last class meeting. Are there any questions on cultural nationalism? The idea of when that sense of shared identity might even be a countervailing force against the state, against governance. If you might hold yourself aloof from the governing structure to some extent. One way to think of that would be, for example, people in the United States, for example, who would say, respect for the law is very important, but the most important law is God's law. In other words, for some deeply religious people, their faith is so strong and so deeply abiding within them that they are guided, or believe themselves that they should be guided more by the law as they understand it, or the will of God as they understand it from scripture or the teachings of their church or whatever, rather than the kind of civil and criminal law that we associate with the state. Okay, that can be a challenge. That is a sense of identity, a shared identity as a believing Muslim, a believing Orthodox Jew, a believing fundamentalist Christian, right? That's a culture, okay? That can be thought of as culture, an expression of identity. Religion is an expression of identity, okay? It's an expression of shared values, right? And a shared sense of right and wrong, or a certain way of framing morality, or whatever it is that can be distinct, for example, from the cohort of people more like me who grew up with little or no religion in their lives. And you can feel really on the outside. I remember when I was like a kid, the idea, we didn't think in terms of either evangelical Christians or fundamentalist Christians. We knew them. We just didn't think of those. First of all, we didn't think of those two things as being fused together, because historically they weren't very often. That didn't really happen until right around 1980 in the United States, because a fundamentalist, right, as an identity, okay, a fundamentalist historically is someone, again, whose fundamental law is God's law, however that is understood through ritual and observance and scripture and dogma and all the things associated with religion, right? But those people, because of their fundamental faith that guides their lives, withdraw from secular society. Because their idea is the only way that we can do this is to withdraw. So in other words, they will tend to withdraw to rural areas that are unincorporated, or to buy land and then have settlements or something like that. Think about like the Amish and the Mennonites and people like that. Those are fundamentalist people, right? They withdraw from mainstream American life. They're not really even American. They see themselves as Amish or whatever. They see themselves as plain, meaning, we use nothing that's not in some way explained in the Bible. Now, obviously, that's changed a little bit because, we had Mennonites when I lived in Willows, California as a kid, and they would come into town and they drove a truck. Well, there weren't any trucks in the Bible, but for the most part, they withdrew. They would come into town and they'd get stuff, but they would cheat sometimes and they would buy store-bought clothing. Normally, like with the Amish, you don't do that, because the idea is it's a self-reliant community. An important component of a fundamentalist community is self-reliance, right? You don't rely on the secular world because you see it as fundamentally corrupt. Okay, it's decadent, it's corrupt, it's strayed from the path. Okay, so that's a culture within a culture. So that leads us to the last discussion here. Okay, not only can it put strain on the unification of a nation state, but also it brings us to this notion of multiculturalism, which is, you'll notice, the last link on the Moodle page. Now, when you think of multiculturalism, what do you think of? I understand that most of you haven't had a chance to do the reading yet. As long as you please do it, before Sunday, before you do your assignment. But a lot of you use the term multicultural, or you hear it in some of your courses, or your friends might use it, or you heard it in your K through 12 education, whatever. What is multiculturalism to you? What is it? Now I'm asking for your perception of this, right? This is one of those times where okay, what do you think it means? Multiculturalism.
At least through my time in high school, a lot of the times that multiculturalism was brought up was like, or we had like a multiculturalism week, and so it's like, okay, let's like talk about and like highlight these different cultures and like look at these really nice things about it,
Mm-hmm.
But that was just about as far as it went within my school, and that's, I don't know. I know there's more to it, but that's what I've been.
No, that's fine. No, I'm asking you what your experience of that is, and you're telling that's fine. Was there an explanation of why you would want to do that?
It was like, there's I think it was like a bit of, like learning tolerance for other cultures and whatnot, and be like, hey, this is different, but this is America. There's so many different people and whatnot within
Which
the
is true.
Yeah.
It's not a lie,
Mm-hmm.
But you just pointed out, Kennedy, a real key to a functioning multicultural society, which is tolerance. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when if you don't have a very high degree of tolerance, multiculturalism becomes very problematic. It becomes very difficult to deal with. Okay. So when you hear the word tolerance, and again, I'm not just asking Kennedy. I mean, she's sort of done her part here. Take a rest, have a drink, you're fine. But for the rest of you, what would tolerance mean? What does tolerance mean?
Respecting other people's culture, even if you don't really understand it.
What does it mean to respect a culture, Emma?
Not make fun of it, not question other people's beliefs, not, I guess, hating other people because of their differences in their culture, whether it's beliefs or traditions.
What if you find, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
Okay, are you done? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because you bring up this really interesting point. You said we got to respect people's beliefs. What if you find those beliefs to be really repellent, like really frightening or really dangerous, or just really awful in some way? Why would you want to respect something that you find repellent?
I mean, if it doesn't directly affect you and it's not harming you, I believe you should just let people believe in what they want to believe.
Well,
I'm not really sure.
Suppose, for example, suppose you lived in some community more like the kind of community I was talking about a while ago, sort of fundamentalist community. And you had tremendous respect for whatever the contours of that religious belief were. It's all you'd ever really known. Your parents espoused it and propagated it with you and your siblings and everything else, and it seemed to work. And then suddenly you encountered someone who said, it's ridiculous that you believe that because it's all garbage and there's no God and there's no invisible powers that help you and prayer is nonsense and all that. And not only that, but we don't respect life the same way you do. You're supposed to respect that?
I mean, not necessarily, but
you said we had to.
I mean, um, I guess depending on like how, if somebody's like forcing their beliefs onto you and
Well,
like
is
trying
that
to,
person forcing their belief on you when they say, I don't believe any of that stuff? Is that forcing a belief on you?
not necessarily, but if they're saying that you shouldn't believe in something because it's not true or because they don't believe that it's true, I feel like that's kind of forcing somebody's belief on you, I guess.
So in other words, tolerance means you cannot question people's beliefs?
I mean, you can.
Can I add something?
Sure, yeah.
I
And
think that it's
Emma, I'm not trying to
important.
box you
Oh,
into the
sorry.
corner. We're exploring an idea. You're doing
Yeah.
fine. I don't mean to be beating you up. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm just not really sure.
Yeah, that's okay. No, none of us is sure. That's why we're talking about. Who did I interrupt just
Oh, Shelby.
now? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi. No, you're fine. I just wanted to point out, I feel like Emma's also trying to say that we should recognize the prevalence of people's opinion and how it is still there, but that doesn't mean that you have to necessarily, so like, I feel like that's a kind of concept having to do with tolerating something. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to dislike it or like it, but recognize that it is there.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a slightly nuanced way of doing that. That's consonant with what Emma was saying, I think. But the thing about tolerance that most people, particularly in the United States, don't understand very well is that when you look theoretically or philosophically at the concept of tolerance, it does not mean liking everything. It doesn't. It can't. No one can like everything. And it doesn't make you wrong if you dislike someone's beliefs. And indeed, in a tolerant culture, you can actually be encouraged to question people's beliefs. And they should expect that, because the idea of tolerance is partly it's skepticism, right? It's like, well, I don't know. I don't know if that works for me or not. But also, it's indifference. You are indifferent to what they believe. This is the thing that a lot of people don't understand who espouse things like multiculturalism, is the idea that, well, you should respect everyone's culture. Strictly speaking, tolerance does not require that. And I think, Emma, as you went along, I heard you consolidating that definition. You know, you're like me, you think as you're talking and you air it out. I'll bet you talk to yourself, you know. A lot of us do. I always talk to the smartest person in the room. It's a good thing to do. But I can hear it consolidating where you finally realize it's like, well, no, you can respect their right to have those beliefs, but you don't have to respect the beliefs. That was what I was trying to get at is you're right. You should respect people's right to have those beliefs, even if you find them repellent. But if you find them repellent, a tolerant person will still contest them. Does that make sense? Because again, you've got, you know, the implication here is everybody but you has a right to their beliefs, and you just have to believe what everybody else is thinking or everything. Now, I know that's not what Emma meant, but I think a lot of times when we have like a multicultural day or something like that, you know, a lot of people kind of walk around with their philosophical hands in their pockets thinking, well, I don't want to make anybody mad. I'll just keep myself to myself, and isn't that nice? But what if you really don't like that stuff? You know, I mean, I never understood, growing up the way I grew up, I never understood why people didn't like Mexican food. I never understood it. All right, because all my buddies, you'd go to their house and they got the mom and the aunt and the grandma, you got the abuelita there just making all this great food. And it's like, first of all, you're going to get big as a house because it's all really starchy and lots of lard and all that. But there's nothing better than that. I'm sorry. It's better than a hot dog, you know, and probably more humane. I don't know. But I would find people who were like, that's terrible stuff. Those people, I actually heard a kid say, those people, right, eat like animals. Well, all animals eat. You know, that doesn't even make any sense. I would say that's intolerance. Okay, because the idea there is, and this is something that Emma brought up that's really important, a tolerant person does not cultivate hatred, does not despise people for their differences. Because you see how that's not indifferent? In other words, it's like, well, do whatever you want. I don't care, you know. I mean, I don't have to like it. And I might occasionally ask you to back off a little bit. Like, I don't really like death metal, okay? I just don't. I'm not a big fan. I don't think it takes a lot of talent. You crank up all the gain on a guitar and you play it really, really loud, and then you just sort of groan, and it's like you call it art. Okay, that's cool, whatever. I don't listen to it. I don't dig it. But I listen to a lot of music that people absolutely hate. The idea isn't that people should respect my taste. Just don't kick my ass about it, right? Don't prevent me from using that as an expression of my identity. So you don't have to like it, and the neighbor can ask me to turn it down. That's not intolerant, because what they're not doing is saying, if it was hip hop, I wouldn't ask you to turn that down. But since it's this weird whatever, you have to turn that down because I don't like it. That's kind of intolerance. But the way to understand that in terms of multiculturalism is multiculturalism tends to exist everywhere. Okay, it's not just the United States. It's hard to find a culture, and they are there, that are overwhelmingly of more or less a unified culture. If you go to Southeast Asia, for example, and you go, say, to a country like Laos, okay, you're going to find that ethnically, a very high percentage of the people in Laos are what are called ethnic Lao. That they're, as far back as they can trace their ancestry, it's from that Southeast Asian peninsula, and roughly a certain side of the Mekong River. But you're also going to find a lot of ethnic Lao on the other side of the Mekong River, which is Thailand. Okay, but what you're not going to find is the kind of real complex multi-ethnicity that you'll find in a European country, or that you'll find in the United States, or that you'll find in a place like Brazil, for example, which is incredibly multi-ethnic, multicultural, right? The more complex your society is, the more it requires of you as a tolerant individual. What I'm trying to do is link this back to something that we talked about before, which is urbanization. Some of you did remember from our class discussions, although you may not have cited where you could have cited it, that one of the characteristics of an urban environment is the imperative to be more tolerant, because you're much more likely to encounter diversity in a large urban area. You see what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to tie old concepts that we had into what we're learning now to help you remember them. Another one of those is the general trend toward urbanization means more and more people are moving to cities. Well, then what does that demand of you? More and more tolerance. And you're more and more likely to encounter multicultural environments, because the city is drawing people in for jobs and healthcare and education and all the things that an urban environment is more likely to be able to provide than will somebody living out in the hinterland somewhere. All right? So that the more we urbanize, the more we become aware of multiculturalism. Okay. Now, what's good about that? What's good about multiculturalism? Because most of what you hear now about multiculturalism, most of it's driven by educators, and most of it's in public education. And generally speaking, multiculturalism and cultural diversity and all that are held up as these really great things. What's great about it? What's good about it?
Would it
I
be
thought that was
then
an easy question.
would it be then like learning about different cultures and whatnot then opens up new information for you?
Exactly.
And then could that in itself then be linked to like globalization?
Yes, because it connects you with these phenomena that are occurring all over the globe and makes it easier for you to understand and deal with them. Exactly. It's incredibly educational. I had the great good fortune to spend most of my life around people who were not like me in some way or another, and in some meaningful way or another. And as a consequence of that, you become richer as a human being. There's a notion of languages that I think is really beautiful. And that is, when you acquire a second language, you acquire a second soul. Okay. What it means is that to really master a language, you need to be able to think and feel in that language. And when I was really immersed in speaking Spanish in neighborhoods and things, I would find myself dreaming in Spanish. And I would know the language in a way that when I was awake, I couldn't call it Have you ever had that happen where you dream something and it's right there for you and you can make use of this and it's really great, and then you wake up and it's like you don't have your vocabulary, you can't remember the word for something, whatever. Language will do that, and what it's doing is essentially it's kicking open doors and allowing you to see more, and not just see it, but become more of a part of it. Okay, but if you don't have that experience, and that's going to be more common with people who come from areas other than these densely populated cities, if you don't have that experience, it can be very threatening. So not everybody's going to experience multiculturalism as a uniformly positive thing. We're seeing some of that right now in the United States, and it's being played out in partisan politics and everything else right now, where there's a cohort of America who comes from areas that aren't densely populated, that are disproportionately rural. If you look at a map of the United States, you know, and you divide it into sort of red and blue, blue is Democrat, red is Republican, even though those maps are largely fraudulent, the first thing you'll notice is there's this sea of red that would make it appear that overwhelmingly this country is Republican and conservative. But we know that that's not true. It's just that when you go to where most of the people live, most of those people, or usually a majority of those people, right, are more likely to vote Democrat than Republican. That's important because it tells us something about those big red areas of the map, that it's not surprising in those sparsely populated, largely rural and small town areas of the map, things like multiculturalism, diversity, the emancipation of women, you know, the empowerment of previously disempowered minorities, all of those things threaten the only way of life many of those people have ever known. Okay, now understand, this is not to justify it. My job's not to justify anything, because justification is just like judgment. You judge something good or bad. I don't like to judge. I'm not interested in it. I think it's boring. But what is interesting for me is trying to explain things. So when people wonder, well, why are those people that way? Why are there so many, you know, white nationalists or bigots or whatever in these small towns and everything? Because that's all they have in many cases. You won't remember this probably, but when Barack Obama was president, at one point, he was meeting with some Democratic fundraisers. He made a remark about people in small towns clinging to guns and God. Okay. Now, unfortunately, even in the so-called liberal media, that was taken completely out of context. He was trying to empathize with that. He was trying to explain to these snobby elite Democrats who are all totally removed from and contemptuous of rural life that, look, you know, there are a lot of different ways to live in this country. And there are people who feel like a lot of their future is being taken away. A lot of life as they've known it for generations is gone or going. And the only thing they have left are, you know, the sense of self-reliance that they have in things like the Second Amendment, and the sense of being able to survive and be resilient in their religious faith, guns and God. He wasn't being contemptuous at all. It's not like when Hillary Clinton made the remark about a basket of deplorables. That's pretty contemptuous, right? Both of those are articulations of the dark side of multiculturalism. Those people don't think like us. They're different. And then, of course, the dark side of that would be, as a consequence of their differences, they're wrong and we're right. And we need to take power away from them. See, that's where multiculturalism can become a problem. And not just in the United States. This is a particular problem, for example, for those of you who stay with international studies, and maybe you become very interested in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or Central America or something like that. Look at the legacies of colonialism. One of the legacies of colonialism is it can actually throw together disparate peoples into a single territorial colony who either never encountered each other before and might have completely incompatible cultures, or who had adversarial cultures and now were compelled to inhabit the same legally bounded territory within the same nation state, even though they see themselves as parts of very different nations. All of the atrocities that we saw in Rwanda when you were all just kids, those things happened in part, and in significant part, as a consequence of the legacy of colonialism and throwing together two people who had very different lifestyles, very different cultures, and cultures and lifestyles that were incompatible. And then you made them, upon independence, they had to contest with each other for power. Okay, that is a recipe for disaster. Okay, so the idea of looking at multiculturalism is, yes, there are, as Kennedy and others have pointed out, there are some real affirmatives to that. It can be a wonderfully enlightening experience to hang out with people. It can be a little alienating and a little humbling too, can't it? I mean, those of you who traveled someplace where people aren't speaking English and figure they don't want to, and you don't understand what they're saying, that can be really humbling. But there's nothing wrong with being humbled. But the other side of that is, when you go someplace and just walking out the door, you're looked at as not only different, but alien. Okay, that can be dangerous. That can be really dangerous. That is where we put this extraordinary strain on our capacity to tolerate. And not everybody's tolerant. You know, if you can't tolerate the things you don't like, you ain't tolerant. Okay, if all you put up with are the things you like, that doesn't make you tolerant. It makes you boring, but it doesn't make you tolerant. So multiculturalism then, and you get more of this if you take the time to read, but one of the things about multiculturalism is it does enhance in a way, or can enhance, a kind of separateness, right? Instead of looking at sort of cultural hybridism, like, you hear people in biology and plant science and stuff like that talk about what's called hybrid vigor, all right? My family's a perfect example of that, all right? We're completely multi-ethnic, all right? People were jumping fences all over the place. As a consequence of that, we're these funny looking little people who live to be 95, all right? And almost never have cancer and don't have like heart disease and stuff until we're 90 or 80 or whatever. I mean, we live a long time and we don't get sick, all right? Now, somebody would say, yeah, that's hybrid vigor. It's because you're not just one isolated strain of human being who might be vulnerable to things, okay? I mean, I'm being facetious in a way, but I'm also not, right? That is an actual adaptive advantage of the species. There are advantages, to the idea of reproducing a society that is multicultural, okay? But ultimately, having a kind of hybridized culture that's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. How many of you have ever lived in any of the border states, particularly the border of Texas or border of California, stuff like that? Because if you have, it's much more common that you're going to be speaking some Spanish. It's much more common that you're going to jet across the border and go get a beer in Mexico or something like that. You might have friends whose families come from Mexico. It's a casual thing. You don't think of that border as having very much meaning at all, okay? Because borders can reinforce cultural nationalism, right? They can make it, in some ways very negatively, much more meaningful. When you're crossing the border back from Mexico, looking Mexican can be a liability, because people are going to look at you more than once, and they're going to probably be more vigorous about asking you for your ID and things like that. But if you're white, and you're obviously white, and you're walking across the border, they're probably just going to wave you through, Okay, that's where culture and borders matter, okay? When borders define culture to the extent that they do, where they become politicized, they acquire political meaning. What we mean by something becoming politicized, it means we give it value in terms of how we determine the terms of order, in terms of who's in charge and who isn't. Race matters in the United States, not because it matters biologically or any other way, not because it's meaningful in anthropology or biological sciences for the most part. We make it matter because we've established a country based on race as part of the power structure. Okay, we have done that. And you don't have to like it, but it's a fact on the ground. We made race matter. Now, there's hardly a country that hasn't, okay? That's where multiculturalism can become problematic, okay? Because if you have people who are generationally disempowered simply by virtue of their ethnicity or their so-called race, right? Then you can have a real problem of generational resentment, impoverishment, all kinds of things can go wrong. We are also seeing that played out in the United States right now. Now, one of the responses to that is we need to change the law to empower people we've been crushing for generations. But does it make sense what I'm talking about, first of all, when I'm mentioning sort of multiculturalism as it becomes relevant to political power? Okay, in other words, if it's used to determine whether or not someone gets health care or whether or not someone gets stopped by the police, all of those are exercises of state power or decisions promulgated and protected by state power to some extent. Whether or not, a bank is compelled to give you a bank loan, okay, that's a regulation. And if the bank is allowed to deny you a bank loan simply because of your, what you look like, then that becomes a problem. That's where multiculturalism can become institutionalized as racism. Okay. And so one of the ways that various societies going forward have tried to deal with that is this concept, and I put the assignment there, the reading for you, of what's called group differentiated rights. Okay, the article explains to you kind of the technical term of group differentiated rights. It's about 11 pages, but you can skim the first couple of paragraphs and get the idea. Does anybody know what that means, group differentiated rights, or can you guess from the term what it might mean, put in the context of this discussion?
Like the right of, did I cut somebody off?
No, I was just going to say, go ahead.
Okay. Like the rights of different cultural groups and whatnot within, a certain like nation or whatnot.
Okay, think about in the United States, think about things like affirmative action. What's affirmative action?
Like actively working towards actively like working towards change for a certain issue or whatnot.
Well, this is a specific targeted policy.
Affirmative action, doesn't it make sure that all minority groups are given a fair chance at university?
Not just universities, at anything having to do with any institution that is in any way related to the national government. So for example, private businesses are not covered by affirmative action. A private university wouldn't be covered by affirmative action if it does not have any contract with the federal government. Every state has contracts with the federal government. So every state employment is governed by affirmative action, okay? So that all public institutions and any business that's contracting with the federal government. So say, for example, the corporations that comprise what's sometimes called the military industrial complex, because they have extensive multi-billion-dollar contracts with the United States government, they can be subject to the enforcement of affirmative action. And it means that you're taking affirmative action to ensure that in hiring, promotion, termination, everything, that a minority status is not a disadvantage, and indeed might be an advantage in the short run. Okay, all other things being equal, you are more likely then to be predisposed to hire a previously disadvantaged minority group. Okay, now it's an open question as to whether or not affirmative action has worked or not, but there's one way in which we know for sure that affirmative action has been extraordinarily effective. If you had to guess, who would you say has been the largest beneficiaries, the most obvious beneficiaries of affirmative action and all the policies related to that over the last 50 years? I didn't hear what that was. I still didn't hear you. Zachary, it sounds like you're coming to us from Venus, man. Put it in the chat. Now I'm curious. My microphone has been very iffy. No kidding. All right, come on. Affirmative action. Who have been people of color? Response? No. Incorrect. Sorry.
White women.
No points. Who?
White women.
White women. White women. Overwhelmingly. Admissions to universities. Movements toward pay equity. Movements toward pay equity. Advancement within corporations. Everything. the most conspicuous advances in the last 50 years have been enjoyed by middle class, largely middle class white women. And that has been a success. Now, here's the thing. That's not why affirmative action was created. People of color have not been consistently advantaged by affirmative action. They have not improved their situation economically in any conspicuous way over the last 50 years. When you look at the pay differential between, say, a black man and a white man doing the same job, the differential is about what it was 50 years ago, controlling for inflation. It hasn't changed significantly. When you look at the university graduation rates for a white man and a black man, it hasn't changed, really hasn't changed. But when you look at white women, 50 years ago, white women were not a majority of university students. They are now, okay? The ratio of women to men, and again, not just white women, but women to men in general, in universities nationally is about 55, 45 women. That's like completely turned on its head from 50 years ago. That's an advance. That's a significant advance, because we all know that, particularly until recently, achieving a university graduate, graduating from a university, but especially having graduate education beyond the 4 years is an extraordinary advantage for professional advancement. And women are knocking it out of the park. Women are more likely than men to graduate with a university degree right now. That was never the case anywhere in the universe until recently, okay? But where it didn't really work was where it was originally intended to work, which was people of color, and particularly African Americans. It hasn't really worked. It hasn't worked. And yet you'll hear people railing against affirmative action all the time as this incredibly destructive thing that is unfair and it's biased and everything else. And yeah, well, there was bias that created the need for it. You can look at it that way. One response is, well, does that really work? That would be a kind of example of a group differentiated right, okay? That is, there's a special need within a group, okay? Here's one of the problems, though, that's not often thought about with the whole notion of multiculturalism and group differentiated rights. How many of you think of yourself as having a single identity? Like, you know who you are. As an individual, you know who you are, okay? Is it really a single identity? Is every woman just a woman? And therefore is there really a distinct group called women? No, there's not. Any more than there is a distinct group called men. Is there a distinct group that we know has a common identity called white? No. Then why would we assume that there might be a group that we will call African American or Black or Latinx or Asian or whatever, as though, right? As though, aha, we've identified you, we've categorized you. It's hard to make it work. I won't say it doesn't work, but it's really hard to make that work with the force of law, because the more typical thing, particularly again, the more we urbanize and the more we secularize, the typical thing is that we have shared identities. We have multiple identities, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that we would think of ourselves as multiracial, even though most of us are, right? Which shows how little race means. But there are any number of identities that any one of us inhabits, and they're authentic senses of identity. They have a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning. I have an identity, for example, as a father, okay? And the men I know who never had kids can't relate to that. I mean, they can't. The first thing, when I first, or my first son was born was, not you. You shouldn't have kids. Because everyone assumed you're not in that group. You're not in the dad group, okay? But you are. You become part of that. And there's a different cohort of people who will go through their lives and not have kids, okay? By the way, that matters, because there are experiences and expenses and burdens that are carried by people raising children that are not carried by people who don't raise children. And unless the economic system reflects that, you're going to have a lot of kids going without. Okay, does this make sense what I'm saying? In other words, there are a lot of ways to think of groups that have real meaning that aren't captured always by this notion of group differentiated rights. But also, if you just say of someone, okay, well, you are or you claim to be African American. Suppose we decided, for example, and this is an idea that is often taken seriously. This would be a classic extreme example of group differentiated rights. Reparations for slavery. Now, when I'm talking about that, do you know what I'm talking about? When I say reparations for slavery in the United States, do you know what I'm talking about? I need to know that you know what I'm talking about, because otherwise I won't waste your time explaining it. Somebody tell me yes or no.
No.
No, you don't know?
Yes, I know.
Well, Carson knows everything, and so does Zachary. At least today they claim to. Again, it's the idea that as a legacy of slavery, we have completely stripped of power and potential generations of people merely on the basis of their ancestry, largely as West African. Okay. And that the only way that we'll ever be able to make that right, affirmative action obviously hasn't worked. We're going to have to put some money up, and we're going to have to put $1 trillion up, something like that. That is, admitting you're wrong is not enough. And by the way, most of American leadership hasn't even admitted that. Okay. Taking down statues is not enough, because that doesn't empower anyone. That doesn't pay the bills. Oh, Woodrow Wilson was a racist, so let's just take his statue down. Or George Washington had slaves, so, but then that means that we're not going to acknowledge anything to do with, in other words, you can't just rewrite history by taking statues down. And even if you can, that does not help people get jobs. It doesn't. So this is the theory behind the idea of reparations. Okay. That if you decided that, who gets the money? How do we know who's a descendant of slaves? It isn't going to be skin color. It isn't. I mean, I know that from my own family, because a lot of my family, the Portuguese, came from the Azores. Those are slave islands. And just because you can't tell it by looking at me doesn't mean that somewhere back there, people didn't have to pay that price. Another part of my ancestry, right, were forced onto reservations if they weren't exterminated. Where are my reparations for that? Should I get reparations for that?
No.
Why not? It kept generations of my mom's side of the family at or near poverty, only because they were looked at as animals. That seemed like a pretty confident no. Now, again, obviously I'm not arguing with you, and I'm not asking for reparations. I'm doing just fine. But you see where by trying to do right, we run into an immediate wall. Okay, we've got this plan. We're going to have reparations, and we're going to try and correct an historic wrong that has distorted our economy and has stripped, millions of people of potential. Okay, but how do we do it? That's the challenge of multiculturalism when you're dealing with power and the decisions about who gets what, when, and how. That is, when you politicize it. And reparations would be explicitly political. They are not merely economic, they're political. Because all those decisions are political decisions. They are legally binding on a public. Taxpayers will have to pay that, okay? And, you can say, well, in theory, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. How do you do it? This is, you'll notice when you talk about group differentiated rights, one of the challenges is who's going to define the group and how? So it can be a problem is what I'm suggesting. And it's one of those things that's going to be a source of contestation that people are going to argue over. And that can lead them back into their own little senses of identity. And it can distance people, and it can make the likelihood of weaponizing multiculturalism, more likely. That's the great challenge of a diverse multicultural society, is when it gets down to deciding the haves and the have-nots, or who gets what, when, and how, that's when people will fight. That's when those resentments will catch fire, and it'll be like, no, you don't get this because I ain't paying taxes for that. It's not my fault. You'll hear this all the time. My family didn't keep slaves. First of all, you don't know that. Most Americans don't know their ancestry. Most Americans don't know their history, but they don't even know their own family history. So you don't know if your ancestors, you don't know if they were racist. You don't know if they ever lynched anybody. You don't know anything about your families, most of you. Okay. So it's kind of idiotic to say, well, I don't have slaves. Yeah, it's because it's illegal, dude. I'm not impressed.
Mr. Hughes,
Patricia, yeah.
I have a friend who has received how do you say it?
Reparations.
I have speech impediments, so some things I can't pronounce. But he was interred in World War II. He's
Yeah.
a Japanese citizen, and was in a
Wait a
concentration.
minute. Was he a Japanese citizen or was he Japanese American?
Well, his family is Japanese. He's Japanese, and his whole family was taken and put on a train and taken somewhere out in Bakersfield.
Okay, but remember, most of those people weren't Japanese. They were American.
Well, he's Japanese.
Is he from Japan?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Well, then if he's from Japan, unless he's very, very old, and then you wonder, well, what was he doing here? If he was just visiting or whatever,
Well,
or if he
his
was waiting to
families
get
were-
citizenship.
His family was working in the fields and out in Benicia somewhere. And when they took him away, he was really happy because he didn't have to work in the fields anymore, even though he was like, 5 or 6 years old when it happened.
Yeah. Well, there were reparations for the Japanese who were interned, and they were, for the most part, Japanese Americans, because there is still that thing of locking up people who are not your own citizens. That's generally frowned upon unless they violate American law. So what happened with people who were Japanese and were not citizens was that a lot of them were compelled to go back to Japan. So it sounds like he got, as a kid, just got vacuumed up in one of the resettlements to the concentration camps. But again, so we do have some precedent of that. Actually, no. I mean, a 5-year-old kid is gonna know whether or not they're happy in a camp or not. Remember, we're not talking about death camps. But
No.
I don't know how many of you have ever read J.G. Ballard wrote a book about being in a Chinese concentration camp
Oh,
run by the Japanese, and Steven Spielberg made a movie about it. When he was, one of his first reactions, I remember hearing him interviewed, in San Francisco, and he was talking about it and saying, well, at first it was just an adventure. He was like 11. It was just an adventure. And there were all these Americans, and he was hanging out with the Americans, and, we all talk funny and scrounge and get good food and intimidate the Japanese and everything else. And then it became a nightmare because they starved. Okay. But no, kids are amazingly adaptive, And so, yeah, sure. It's perfectly plausible that a 4 or 5-year-old kid, going to a relocation camp where you don't have ovens and stuff might think, yeah, this isn't so bad. I don't have to work in the fields anymore. In fact, all I have to do is a little bit of school, and my mom and dad kind of leave me alone because they're all distraught and everything. Yeah, that might be paradise for a kid. Sure. Because again, how would he remember being less than 5? Well, a lot of us do. I remember being 3. It's not hard to remember. And I remember how I felt about things when I was 3 or 4. Yeah, I mean, if you think it's important to remember. I remember being 3 or 4 more vividly than I remember being 17, And no, very few people were killed in those camps. I don't want to get into this whole thing again. I'm just not in the mood to hate America today. If we are not going to draw a distinction between an admittedly outrageous atrocity of taking people, dispossessing them of all their property, relocating them to camps and leaving them there for the duration of the war, and a policy of exterminating them in ovens and making soap out of their remains. No, there's no moral equivalency there. So can we please not do that today? I don't think that's very interesting. It's not to justify one and condemn the other. It's just that it's not a moral equivalency, you know, and that's just a fact on the ground. I would remind you too that after the Second World War, knowing what we knew, not only about the Japanese concentration camps that we had, we also did that, by the way, for some Germans and Italians, everyone forgets that. But knowing what we knew about the extermination camps, the United States Congress in the 1950s was pushing aggressively legislation that would have created concentration camps for people identified as communists. There was only one other country that had done that, and that was Nazi Germany. So we actually did not learn from that the right lesson. And by the way, some of those supporters included John F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, and a lot of allegedly liberal Democrats. This wasn't just a bunch of lunatic right-wingers. That was something that everyone was kind of going along with. But the important thing is it didn't work, because enough people, there was a critical mass of people who thought we can't do that. Okay. Now, we did send people to prison simply for being communists. Dennis versus United States, 1951. Okay. But within a few years, most of those sentences had been struck down, commuted, or pardoned in some way. And you know, I mean, we're not yet Nazi Germany. We're not yet fascist. We're not yet a lot of the things that everyone seems to be upset about right now. You know, could we be going in that direction? Certainly we could. But first of all, that's not the subject matter of the class today. But this idea of just sort of reflexively, you know, dinging the United States, and somehow, I don't know who you would hold up as the moral superior, but it's just not historically accurate. Every great power commits atrocities that are visible and enduring. Little powers do it too, it just doesn't show up. Okay, so that's a whole different discussion. All right, Zachary. Yeah, you know, the whole thing at the border is an atrocity as well. I don't know even what the term cultural genocide means. I don't know why you would insist on that. I'm not sure what we're learning from that. Again, you can condemn a policy without trying to hyperbolically, you know, inflate it, and thereby really do nothing about it. Okay, so what I want you to do then is take a look at the assigned readings. Try and read them with an open mind if that's at all possible. And you already know, you can see the prompt, it's right below there, so you know what I'm asking you to do. I think the easiest way for you to approach this assignment would be to open up a Word doc or something, look at the Moodle page, look at those links, look at the prompt, and establish a little outline. Outline question 1 and outline question 2. And you have elements. Okay, in question 1, what do I have to do? Okay, I have to think about culture and nation and how they might function in helping us understand different societies. Okay. Now, if you are willing to go beyond the fact that whatever else we conclude, we must also conclude that the United States is an empire of butchers, then I guess I'm going to have to figure out a way to grade that. Otherwise, tell me what you understand from the readings in our discussions, but particularly the readings about culture and nation, okay, as they're discussed in the readings. And then for the second one, another outline, you know, culture or cultures either way, and the idea of power or public governance and a nation state. Now, there is a separate link there on the global system of nation states. We just talked about multiculturalism and cultural nationalism. You could link those together into some discussion of, you know, kind of what we've just had. Well, what would be good about culture and a nation? You know, the idea of diversity and the, you know, the illuminating elements of that, and, you know, some of the things that Kennedy talked about and other things earlier, right? But there's also a downside to that. How do we make sure that we don't politicize it and use that diversity in our determinations of who gets what, when, and how, you know? All right, so are there any questions there?
Just one?
Yep.
Because these are short paragraphs, do you want us to cite what we know?
As it says in the prompt, and as I mentioned earlier, you must cite everything you use.
Got
But
it.
again, just simply taking stuff from the readings and sticking it in a paragraph is not sufficient. So if you take something, preferably not a direct quote, but if you paraphrase something, your next sentence should be something like, in other words, or to clarify, or as an example, so that you're showing me not just that you know how to go find something like it's a scavenger hunt and stick it in there, but that you actually know what it means in the context of the prompt, that you can think using these concepts and using this literature. That's what I'm really looking at. And again, I'm not interested in your judgments. I'm interested in your understanding of things. There is a difference. For some of you, you need to work on this a little bit between, the often cavalier way in which you can judge and condemn as opposed to really trying to learn. Okay. I mean, yeah, if you want to talk about, who's wrong and who's right and all that, that might be an interesting bar discussion, but it doesn't demonstrate much learning. It doesn't demonstrate much understanding. It's really easy to condemn other people. That really just makes you a bigot. And I don't think universities should be teaching people to be bigots. So, just be aware of that. Anything else? When's it due?
Sunday.
At what time?
11?
11 p.m. In other words, you have the whole weekend. Okay? Please don't turn it in late. I'm not going to be interested in what kind of adventures you got into over a Halloween weekend. You are going to have to make some time.
Yeah.
All right? All right then. So I'm going to go ahead as soon as I get done here. I will put the links up for the next few classes and everything, just to remind you that, we haven't quit yet. And I'll try to remember beforehand to send you all an email or something reminding you about Wednesday, whatever it is, the 11th or 12th, Veterans Day. Okay? All right. I'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Bye.